Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck. This one is Avacyn Enraged. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is we are going to scryfall.com, selecting a random Magic the Gathering card, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a deck around a theme of the chosen card. So for this week, our random card was Brash Taunter. The 4 and a red for a goblin. It's a 1/1 with indestructible, and whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent, and we can pay 3, tap it, and have it fight another target creature. So, I'm a big fan of Brash Taunter personally. I actually play it in a few of my own decks, and so I decided that what's the best way to take advantage of a card like Brash Taunter? Obviously, we got to put it in the best color combination, Boros. And we want a commander in the command zone that can actively deal damage to Brash Taunter. So we looked at Archangel Avacyn, which flips into Avacyn the Purifier. So Archangel Avacyn on the front is 3 white for a legendary creature angel, 4/4 flash, flying, vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn, and whenever a non-angel creature you control dies, transform Archangel Avacyn at the beginning of the next upkeep. Then, once she transforms into Avacyn the Purifier, she's a 6/5 flying angel that when it transforms into Avacyn the Purifier, it deals 3 damage to each other creature and each opponent. So, my line of thinking here is that we flip Avacyn the Purifier. She does 3 damage to all creatures, including, hopefully, the Brash Taunter, which then does 3 damage to anything else we want. Now, Brash Taunter is not the only creature in Magic that does what it does. Personally, I think it does what it does the best because it's indestructible, can hit pretty much anything, but there are other creatures that do that. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at some of our themes, and we'll try to pick apart what this deck is actually trying to do. So, step 1, we want to do damage to creatures. And so that means we are running a lot of damage-based board wipes. So Blasphemous Act, a very good example, 8 and a red, and this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. So if there are 8 creatures on the battlefield or more, it only costs 1 red mana, and then it deals 13 damage to each creature. If we have Brash Taunter in play, that means we can do 13 damage to each creature, and then 13 damage to any other target we want. So this is super useful. We run a ton of different effects like this in the hopes that we'll be able to take advantage of our creatures on the board that can do damage to our opponents. Our second theme are cards that want to be dealt damage, and creatures that want to take some form of damage, whether it's from a massive board wipe like Blasphemous Act, or it's just a small, maybe 3 damage from Avacyn, or even 1 from some other source. So in this case we have Flumph. It's 1 and a white for a jellyfish, 0/4, defender flying. Whenever Flumph is dealt damage, you and target opponent each draw a card. So we are able to take a Flumph, we're able to do 3 damage to it with Avacyn. We draw a card and opponent draws a card, which isn't super great giving one of our opponents a card, but in the end, we control who gets it, and we are able to, because we have more than one opponent, we are able to get more advantage out of this. We draw a card and one other player draws a card. And this isn't the only card that wants to do this kind of effect, but we do have tons of creatures that want to be taking damage, and we have tons of ways to do damage. And then, finally, the last theme that we have in this deck is that we want to be able to protect our own creatures. So Boros Charm is a red and a white for an instant, and we choose 1. Boros Charm deals 4 damage to target player or planeswalker. Permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn, or target creature gains double strike until end of turn. Now, in this deck, the most important one of those abilities is the second one. Giving our permanents indestructible is super useful. So, if we just use the 3 cards that are on screen right now, we cast a Blasphemous Act, we do 13 damage to Flumph, but before that resolves, we can give Flumph indestructible with Boros Charm. So not only are we presumably wiping all of our opponent's creatures off the board, we're also hitting all of our creatures, getting a ton of benefit from them that want to be taking damage, and keeping them around because they now have indestructible. And that is the main idea of what our deck is trying to do, which is another good reason why we have Avacyn in the command zone, because she can flash in and give our creatures indestructible. And then when she flips, she's a board wipe. So she's able to pull double duty and hopefully get us to the point where we're able to do this multiple times throughout the course of a game and value our way to the victory. So, looking at our themes, let's take a look at some key cards, some cards that, if I had to pick 3 cards in this deck that you want to have on board when you're starting to go off, these are those cards. And the first one is Firesong and Sunspeaker. It's 4 red-white for a legendary creature, Minotaur Cleric. This was the other card that I thought about using as our commander. And it's a 4/6, and it says red instant and sorcery spells you control have lifelink. And whenever a white instant or sorcery spell causes you to gain life, Firesong and Sunspeaker deals 3 damage to target creature or player. So, the second part, not super relevant. We're not really going to be gaining life off of a lot of instants and sorceries. That's okay. Instead, the big selling point of this card for us is that red instant and sorceries have lifelink. Because we are using a ton of damage-based board wipes, stuff like Blasphemous Act, we are going to be gaining life off of it. So if there are 2 creatures on board and we cast a Blasphemous Act, it does 13 damage to each creature. So that's 26 damage. We gain 26 life. So if that's 10 creatures on board, all of a sudden we've gained over 100 life just from one spell. So Firesong and Sunspeaker is a great way to keep us in the game and keep us surviving long enough to be able to value out our creatures and our damage-based board wipes and hopefully win the game. Our second key card is Star of Extinction, the single biggest damage-based board wipe that I was able to find, not counting X spells. But Star of Extinction is 5 red for a sorcery. You destroy target land. That's just kind of the icing on top of the cake. What we really want it for is that Star of Extinction deals 20 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. So if we have our Brash Taunter on board and we have Firesong and Sunspeaker, and we can give things indestructible, we will be able to keep our board, do 20 damage to each creature, gaining who knows how much life, hopefully with Firesong and Sunspeaker, and being able to turn that damage from Brash Taunter into our opponents. And then finally, our last key card is Toralf, God of Fury. So Toralf is 2 red for a legendary creature God, a 5/4 with trample. Whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, Toralf deals damage equal to the excess to target other than that permanent. So if we cast Star of Extinction and our opponent has a 1/1 creature, Toralf sees that 1/1 take 20 damage, which is 19 more than is needed to kill it. So Toralf does 19 damage to any other permanent. So in theory, if our opponent has a bunch of little 1/1s, we can do 20 to 1, and then 19 to another, 18 to another, and we can go down the chain, hopefully getting rid of any opponent's creatures, or we can just send that damage straight to our opponent's faces. And Toralf does have a backside to him. It's Toralf's Hammer, 1 in a red for a legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature has 1 in a red, tap, unattach Toralf's Hammer. It deals 3 damage to any target. Return Toralf's Hammer to its owner's hand. An equipped creature gets +3/+0 as long as it's legendary. It equips for 1 in a red. Honestly, we'll probably never play this side of it. It's alright, but in the end, what we really want is Toralf's ability to use our excess damage to, 1, kill our opponents, and 2, kill their creatures. So, the other thing that we're going to do before we get into the budget is we're going to take a look at some cool interactions in this deck. Some cards that work very well together and do pretty much what we want to be doing in this deck. So the first one is between Marauding Raptor and a Trapjaw Tyrant. So because we have a lot of creatures that want to be dealt damage, we have a very minor dinosaur sub-theme in this deck. Because a lot of dinosaurs want to be dealt damage. They have the Enraged trigger. So Marauding Raptor, 1 and a red for a 2/3 dinosaur. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, already pretty good. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Marauding Raptor deals 2 damage to it. If a dinosaur is dealt damage this way, Marauding Raptor gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So if we have Marauding Raptor on the board and we cast our Brash Taunter, Brash Taunter immediately takes 2 damage, being able to put that damage somewhere else. So we combine that with Trapjaw Tyrant, 3 white for a 5/5 dinosaur with Enrage. Whenever Trapjaw Tyrant is dealt damage, exile target creature an opponent controls until Trapjaw Tyrant leaves the battlefield. So we play it. It gets hit by Marauding Raptor. Marauding Raptor gets bigger because it's a dinosaur. And then we automatically just exile one of our opponent's creatures. And if we're able to hit it multiple times throughout the course of the turn, if we're able to give it indestructible, we can just exile tons of our opponent's creatures and really not have to deal with them getting them back if they can't deal with the Tyrant. And then our second cool interaction is Lantern Scout and Spite-Mare. Now, I put Spite-Mare in here because it's just another version of Brash Taunter. It's 2 Boros. For an elemental 3/3, whenever Spite-Mare is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target creature or player. So very similar to our Brash Taunter. But Lantern Scout is 2 and a white for a human scout ally 3/2. Whenever Lantern Scout or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. Which sounds kind of weird, but if you look closely at the wording on cards like Spite-Mare, it says that whenever Spite-Mare is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target creature or player. So if we're able to give Spite-Mare lifelink, whenever we deal damage to it, and then it deals damage to something else, we gain that much life because that creature has lifelink. So if we're able to give it lifelink, give it indestructible, and then cast something like a Star of Extinction, we would do 20 damage to Spite-Mare. Spite-Mare does 20 damage to our opponent, and because it has lifelink, we gain 20 life. There's other ways to give lifelink in here. It's not just Lantern Scout, but I did want to point this out because I think that this is a very interesting combination, and it's one that tends to get overlooked playing this kind of deck, so I wanted to make sure I pointed that out. But finally, that brings us to the budget for this deck, and we came pretty close to our budget, $91.90, so about $10 or so under the budget. But the most expensive card in the entire deck was Flawless Maneuver, the 2 and a white for an instant. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn, but if we control a commander, we can cast this spell without paying its mana cost, so incredibly useful. Free spells, always more expensive, but even a free spell in this case, only $7.68, so not super expensive, but if you are looking to cut off some of the top end of this deck, this would be a good card to cut, because we do have other ways to do this ability. It's just not free, which is what makes it so expensive, so it is cuttable, but it is also very useful, so there's arguments for keeping it in and taking it out. But one last thing to do is we need to see how this deck actually works, because the best way to know if a deck is any good is to see it in action. So we are going to run it up against 3 different opponents this week. We have Anji Falconwrath being played by Bilal, Alayla Artful Provocateur being played by Jason, and Feather the Redeemed being played by Shawn. So Bilal's Anji deck is not your traditional Madness style deck. It's actually focused more on reanimation. So he wants to use Anji to discard some cards, reanimate those cards, and hopefully get more value out of them than he should be getting at that stage of the game. And I think we'll be able to manage okay against Anji. I would imagine that some damage-based board wipes could work pretty well against some big reanimated targets. Jason's Alayla deck is actually a completely creatureless deck. The only creature in the entire deck is Alayla. So he's focusing very hard on getting his commander out, being able to cast tons of artifacts and enchantments, and being able to make a ton of fairies and hopefully get into his opponents with that. So again, another deck that I would imagine damage-based board wipe is going to be pretty useful here. And then finally, Shawn's Feather deck. It wants to, as most Feather decks do, be casting tons of instants and sorceries that target Feather or target other creatures he controls. So that way he is able to put them back into his hand at the end of turn. And I think we might be okay against Feather as long as he doesn't have the cheap instants and sorceries that can give indestructible or prevent all damage, because if he's got those, our board wipes really aren't going to do much, and I'd imagine at that point we get run over by Feather. So hopefully we're able to avoid that, but we'll see how it goes. We'll test out the deck, and I will talk to you guys after the game. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Jason, myself, and Shawn. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a mountain and casts Soul Ring. Jason plays a Terramorphic Expanse, cracking it for an island. I play a Temple of Triumph, scrying 1. Shawn plays a mountain. Bilal plays a swamp, casts Solemn Simulacrum, putting a basic land into play from his library. Jason plays a Darksteel Citadel and then casts an Orzhov Signet. I play a Command Tower and cast a Fire Diamond. Shawn plays another mountain and then casts Cold Steel Heart, naming white so it can tap for white mana. Bilal plays a Sulphurous Mire and then casts Nightscape Familiar, making his red and blue spells cost 1 less, and then casts Anji Falconwrath and attacks Shawn for 2. Jason plays a Command Tower and casts his commander Alayla, Artful Provocateur, which makes him a 1/1 fairy token whenever he casts an artifact or enchantment. I play a mountain and then foretell a card. Shawn plays a mountain and casts Alloy Mirror, and then at the end of his turn, Bilal activates Anji to discard a card and draw a card. Then on his turn, he plays a mountain and casts Zagras, Thief of Heartbeats, giving his team Death Touch. He then attacks Shawn for 2 and me for 4 since Zagras has haste. On Jason's turn, he plays a Buried Ruin and then casts a Traveler's Amulet, making a fairy. He follows that up by casting Golden Egg, drawing a card and making a fairy. And he then attacks Bilal for 2, gaining 2 life thanks to lifelink. Then in his second main phase, he casts Winged Words, drawing 2 cards. I play a mountain and cast Trapjaw Tyrant, which exiles a creature until it leaves play every time the tyrant is dealt damage. Shawn plays a mountain and casts his commander Feather the Redeemed before casting Crash Through, giving Feather trample and drawing a card. He then casts a Goblin Instigator, creating a 1/1 Goblin token. Then in Shawn's end step, Crash Through returns to his hand thanks to Feather's ability. Also at the end of turn, Bilal activates Anji to discard a card and draw a card. On Bilal's turn, he activates Anji again, discarding and drawing, and then plays a Gyre Reach Sanitarium before casting a Rakdos Signet. On Jason's turn, he attacks me for 2, gaining 2 life, and in his second main phase, he casts Shadow Spear, making a fairy, and he follows that up by casting Favorable Winds, making a fairy, and giving all his flyers +1/+1. He then plays an Orzhov Basilica, returning an island to his hand. On my turn, I miss my 6th land drop and decide to pass. On Shawn's turn, he casts Crash Through, drawing a card and giving Feather trample. He then plays a mountain, and he casts Show of Confidence, copying it once since he's cast another instant or sorcery. This lets him put a 1/1 counter on his Goblin token and Feather, giving them Vigilance. He then attacks me for 4 with Feather, and I take the damage. At the end of his turn, the 2 spells he cast return to his hand thanks to Feather. Also at the end of turn, Bilal activates Gaia Reach Sanitarium to make everyone draw and discard a card. On Bilal's turn, he casts Noxious Gearhulk, destroying Feather and gaining 5 life. Jason plays a Dark Water Catacombs and casts Soul Guide Lantern, making a fairy, and exiling Sir Conrad from Bilal's graveyard. He then casts Tezzeret Artifice Master and activates Tezzeret's 0 ability to draw 2 cards. Then, at the end of turn, I flash in my commander, Archangel Avacyn. On my turn, I play a Plains, and then cast Chain Reaction, doing 16 damage to each creature. With that on the stack, I cast Cosmic Intervention to return my creatures to play at the end of turn after they're destroyed. Bilal also regenerates Nightscape Familiar and draws a card when Solemn Simulacrum dies, then the board is completely wiped. Shawn plays a Plains on his turn and recasts Feather. He then casts Crash Through, drawing a card and giving Feather Trample, and then at the end of turn, Crash Through returns to Shawn's hand. Bilal casts a Thorn of the Black Rose, becoming the Monarch, plays a Mountain, and then recasts his commander, Anji. At the end of turn, he draws a card for Monarch. Jason plays an Island, and then activates Tezzeret's 0 ability to draw 2 cards, and recasts his commander, Alayla. He then equips Alayla with the Shadow Spear, giving her +1/+1, trample, and lifelink. On my turn, I attack Bilal for 4, becoming the Monarch, and Tezzeret for 5, killing the Planeswalker. Then in my second main phase, I cast Mog Maniac, and whenever that's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent, and in my end step, I draw for Monarch. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Plains, casts Crash Through, drawing a card, giving Feather Trample, and then casts Show of Confidence, copying it once, giving Feather Trample and 2 +1/+1 counters. He then casts a Faced Fetters, targeting Avacyn, gaining Shawn 4 life and making it so my commander can't attack or block before he attacks me for 5. This allows him to become the Monarch. Then at the end of turn, Shawn returns his 2 spells to hand and draws for Monarch. Bilal also activates the Gaia Reach Sanitarium, making everyone draw and discard a card. On Bilal's turn, he plays Sunscorched Desert, doing 1 damage to Jason, and then casts Beseech the Queen, searching his library for a card with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands he controls. This has him putting a Last One Standing to hand, and then he moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 1. But before Shawn blocks, he casts Jeru's Resolve to prevent all damage to Feather, and blocks with his commander. In Bilal's second main phase, he casts Last One Standing to destroy all creatures except for 1 chosen at random. Luckily for me, my Mog Maniac was the designated survivor this time. Bilal then activates the Sanitarium to have everyone draw and discard a card, and at the end of turn, Shawn returns Jeru's Resolve to hand. On Jason's turn, he recasts his commander, Alayla. On my turn, I attack Shawn for 1, becoming the Monarch, and then cast Chandra's Incinerator, which does damage to any of my opponent's creatures equal to the non-combat damage I do to my opponents, and at the end of turn, I draw for being the Monarch. Shawn recasts Feather, and then casts Crash Through, drawing a card and giving Feather Trample, and at the end of turn, returning Crash Through to his hand. Bilal casts a Sangromancer, allowing him to gain 3 life whenever an opponent discards a card or their creatures die, and then he casts Persist, returning Noxious Gearhulk to the battlefield, but in response, Jason sacrifices his Soul Guide Lantern to exile all of his opponent's graveyards, so Persist fizzles. On Jason's turn, he plays a Plains, and then casts Aether Spellbomb, creating a fairy. He also casts Swiftfoot Boots, making a fairy, and then equips Alayla with the Swiftfoot Boots, giving her hexproof and haste. He follows that up by casting Cranial Plating, and equips Alayla with the Cranial Plating, giving her +1/+0 for each artifact he controls. He also equips Alayla with Shadow Spear, giving her +1/+1 trample and lifelink. He then attacks me for 12, becoming the Monarch and gaining 12 life. Then at the end of turn, he draws for being the Monarch. On my turn, I play a Terramorphic Expanse, cracking it for a Plains, and pass. On Shawn's turn, he casts Crash Through, giving Feather trample and drawing a card, casts Talisman of Conviction, he casts Brute Force, giving Feather +3/+3, and then casts Launch the Fleet, making a 1/1 soldier that's tapped and attacking whenever Feather attacks, and finally casts Show of Confidence, copying it 3 times, giving Feather Vigilance, and putting 4 +1/+1 counters on her. He then attacks Jason for 10. At the end of turn, Shawn's spells return to his hand, and he draws for being the Monarch, and Bilal also activates the Gaia Reach Sanitarium, making everyone draw and discard a card. This also has him gaining 21 life thanks to Sangromancer, and Shawn discarding to hand size. On Bilal's turn, he recasts Anji and immediately activates her, discarding a card to draw a card. On Jason's turn, he attacks Bilal for 12 with Alayla, gaining 12 life, and then passes. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Spite-Mare, which, whenever it's dealt damage, deals that much damage to target creature or player. Then, before my end step, Shawn casts Sheltering Light to scry 1 and give Feather indestructible, and then puts it back into his hand at end step. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Clifftop Retreat, and then casts a Phalanx Leader, which puts a 1/1 counter on each creature he controls when it's targeted by a spell, and then casts Crash Through, giving Phalanx Leader trample, giving his team 1/1 counters, and drawing a card. He then casts an Aria of Flame, but Jason counters it with a Cancel. Shawn then casts a Show of Confidence, copying it once, targeting Phalanx Leader and Feather with 1 copy each, giving them a 1/1 counter and Vigilance. He then moves to combat and attacks Jason for 10 with Feather, but it's blocked by a Fairy token. At the end of turn, Shawn's spells go back to his hand, and Bilal once again activates the Sanitarium, making everyone draw and discard a card, and gaining 9 life. On Bilal's turn, he activates Anji to discard a card and draw a card, and then casts Final Parting, searching his deck and putting Sower of Discord to hand and a Swamp into the graveyard. He then casts the Sower of Discord, pairing himself with Jason, making it so whenever one of them takes damage, the other also takes that much damage. Then, at the end of turn, Jason casts a Thirst for Knowledge, drawing 3 cards and discarding an artifact. On his turn, Jason plays an island and casts Nihil Spellbomb, making a fairy. He follows that up by casting Skullclamp, making another fairy, and then attacks me for 13 with Alayla. Before the damage, I cast a Selfless Squire to prevent all combat damage and put 13 1/1 counters on the Squire. In his second main phase though, Jason casts a Time Wipe, returning Alayla to his hand and destroying all other creatures. In response, Shawn casts a Sheltering Light to make Feather indestructible, and then the board wipe resolves, gaining Bilal 33 life, and at the end of turn, Sheltering Light returns to Shawn's hand. I play a Thriving Bluff, naming white so it taps for both my colors, and then cast Boros Reckoner, which, whenever it's dealt damage, deals that much damage to any target. Shawn casts a Storm Kiln Artist, making him a treasure whenever he casts or copies an instant or sorcery, casts a Crash Through to give Feather trample, drawing a card and making a treasure. He then casts a Prophetic Lens, and follows that up with a Moment of Heroism, giving Feather +2/+2 lifelink and making a treasure. He also casts Swift Justice, giving Feather +1/+0 first strike, lifelink, and making another treasure, and finally casts Show of Confidence, copying it 3 times, putting 4 1/1 counters on Feather, giving her vigilance, and making 4 treasures. He then attacks Jason for 15, but before the damage, Jason sacrifices the Aether Spellbomb to return Feather to Shawn's hand. And then, at the end of turn, Shawn recasts Feather and returns all his spells to hand. On Bilal's turn, he activates Gaia Reach Sanitarium, making everyone draw and discard. He discards a Blazing Root Walla, casts it for free thanks to Madness, and then casts Chainer Dementia Master. Jason recasts Alayla, equips her with Swiftfoot Boots and Cranial Plating, and attacks Bilal for 12, gaining 12 life and knocking him out of the game. Then in his second main phase, he equips Skull Clamp to Alayla. On my turn, I simply pass, just hoping to survive. Shawn plays a mountain and casts Crash Through, giving Feather Trample, drawing a card and making a treasure. He then casts a Thought Vessel, giving him no maximum hand size, casts Guided Strike to give Feather +1/+0 and first strike, drawing a card and making a treasure, casts a Runaway Steamkin, and then casts Moment of Heroism, giving Feather +2/+2 and lifelink, making a treasure and putting a counter on the Steamkin, casts Jeru's Resolve and Sheltering Light to give Feather indestructible, preventing all damage done to it, making 2 treasures and scrying 1. Finally, he casts Show of Confidence, copying it 4 times to make 5 treasures, put 5 1/1 counters on Feather, giving her vigilance, and then attacks Jason for 12 total damage. Jason then casts a Rally of Wings to untap Alayla and give her +2/+2, blocking enough damage to survive, but killing Alayla and drawing 2 cards from Skull Clamp. Then, at the end of turn, Shawn's spells return to his hand. On Jason's turn, he plays a Mist Vault Bridge, and then sacrifices Buried Ruin to return Aether Spellbomb from his graveyard to his hand, and then casts the Spellbomb. He also casts Ichor Wellspring, drawing a card. At the end of his turn, Shawn casts all 5 instants in his hand to put 5 1/1 counters on Feather, replacing his treasures and drawing a card. I respond to all of that by flashing in my commander, Archangel Avacyn. On my turn, I cast Blasphemous Act, doing 13 damage to all creatures. And in response, Shawn casts Jeru's Resolve and Sheltering Light to double protect Feather. With the spell still on the stack, I also cast Rootborn Defenses to make my creatures indestructible. And then Blasphemous Act then does 13 damage to Boros Reckoner, so I do that much damage to Shawn as well, before attacking Shawn for 3, and at the end of turn, Shawn's spells return to his hand. On Shawn's turn, he casts an Electrostatic Field, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever he casts an instant or sorcery. He then casts Crash Through, giving Feather Trample, drawing a card and doing 1 damage to each opponent. He casts Guided Strike to give Feather +1/+0, first strike, drawing a card and doing 1 to each opponent. He casts Fist of Flames, drawing a card, giving Feather +4/+0, doing 1 damage to each opponent. Casts Moment of Heroism, giving Feather +2/+2, lifelink, doing 1 to each opponent, and then casts Sheltering Light, scrying 1, giving Feather indestructible, and finally, to top it all off, casts Show of Confidence, copying it 5 times, giving Feather 6 1/1 counters, vigilance, and doing 1 to each opponent. He also casts Unleash Fury, doubling Feather's power and toughness, doing 1 to each opponent, and attacks me for way more than lethal, knocking me out of the game. In his second main phase, Shawn then casts Seize the Day to get another combat step and attack Jason for lethal damage, but Jason sacrifices the Aether Spellbomb to return Feather to Shawn's hand. Shawn then recasts Feather, and in his end step, all of his spells return to his hand. On Jason's turn, he plays a Razor Tide Bridge, and then casts Chromatic Sphere. before casting Rise and Shine Overloaded to turn all of his artifacts into creatures and putting 4 +1/+1 counters on each of them. He equips the Shadow Spear and Cranial Plating to Ichor Wellspring, and then moves to combat, attacking Shawn for a total of 44 damage, which isn't enough to kill him, and knowing about all of the cards in Shawn's hand, Jason decides to concede, winning Shawn the game. Alright, so there was a ton of triggers going on in that game. It was a ton of fun, but holy cow did Feather go off at a few points. We tried super hard to stay in the game. We tried to survive for a few turns after when we probably should have been knocked out. We couldn't quite get our engine going. We couldn't keep our creatures on board or do enough damage to our creatures' opponents to get to where we needed to be. And it was very difficult with all of the massive flyers on board. We didn't have a lot of protection against flyers, so a Layla hitting us for 12 and Feather hitting us for 13 or whoever knows how much at the end there made it very difficult to survive through this game. But I think the deck showed what it can do if given the chance, and I do think that in the future, a little bit of tweaking, maybe making sure that we are able to get some lands, maybe get a little bit more ramp. You notice that we were stuck on lands a little bit for a while there, so that might be something to pay attention to if you decide to put this deck together for yourself. But otherwise, I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please let me know. If you have any suggestions for future cards that you would like to see a deck made out of, please do let me know. I'm always happy to take suggestions. Also, in the description below is my Twitter handle, so please follow me on Twitter so that way you can stay up to date on what's coming on with the decks, what's going on, all that fun stuff. And leave a comment, leave a like, let me know what you liked, what you didn't, and hopefully I can continue to improve in the future. But otherwise, hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.